Hi and welcome to another episode with Lattice Training. Today I have with me Sam Webster. So she is a Pilates teacher and she specialises in pregnancy and postpartum. So welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Do you just want to start telling me a little bit about Pilates and the sort of core sort of concepts behind it? I personally don't know anything about Pilates. We've just been talking about that. And maybe how that fits so nicely into pregnancy and postpartum.
Yeah, well, Pilates is basically a practice that involves 6 principles: concentration, control, centering, precision, breath, and flow. And in order to do any movement, you start with those foundational principles. So in terms of recovery for postnatal, it's a very essential concept and principle to establish before going into some more challenging training. We look at how can you move better, how can you recruit from the right place so that when you're doing more heavy loaded training, it's not going to create injury or strain, or if you've had something like a C-section, you're not going to do damage around the scar and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I guess we're going to go on to talking about climbing, but as you know, I know you've worked with climbers and some aerial gymnasts. When you get back to these big movements or this thing that you love, I think often it's quite easy to not have formed those sort of slightly like deeper connections again, and you're quite distracted when you're climbing. Imagine when you're doing a sport, there's all these other things going on. So
definitely, and it's just about kind of reorganizing your body again. It's been through so much in your pregnancy and through childbirth. Everyone has a completely different experience, so it's just trying to get back to when you're pregnant and when you giving birth, everything's about kind of externalizing, getting things out. Your tummy's getting bigger, your baby's coming out, and then it's postpartum's all about bringing it back. And centering is one of the core principles of Pilates, and it's just how do we do that and how can we get the brain to recognize what our new center is.
Yeah. And I think you made a really good point there, over 9 months, a lot has changed. And I think there's maybe this misconception, or people are just hoping that things will just be back like that, but actually there's this whole process. So you mentioned centering there, and I guess that makes me think of, our core, which we know is really important to movement and climbing, as well as really connected to sort of our proprioception of our body, our arms and legs. So when we think about core, and maybe before we go into pregnancy and we've been through birth, we maybe think about our abs, we do crunches. But it is so much more than that. And I think probably going through pregnancy and birth really sort of illuminates that to a lot of people. I don't know, could you just maybe, from your perspective, sort of explain the core and how it functions well, and what it is about Pilates that helps with that sort of good core function?
Yeah. That's a really important question and concept, and I'm glad you've actually asked it, because there's a lot of people like core, it's just here, but what is it? So you've got your 6-pack muscles, your rectus abdominis muscles, and we work those, and they're kind of on the surface of the body. Then you've got your deeper muscles, so you've got your lower transverse abdominals, and then you've got your diaphragm, which helps with your breathing, your pelvic floor, which is obviously a really important area of the body in pregnancy and postnatal. You've also got your back muscles, and you've got these small little muscles that are close to the spine and quite deep, your multifidus muscles. And all of those are kind of working with your QL, your internal and external obliques, so all the things that help with your rotation. That's all your core, and that's where your power comes. So in Pilates, we have this concept of powerhouse. And all of those structures need to be set in the right position to recruit and then to do any movement. So whether you're doing an arm lift or whether you're doing a leg lift, it all needs to come from this kind of deep muscle recruitment, and that also includes your breath, which is really important, because in order to find your core, breath is one of the quickest ways to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I have seen out there that people can maybe do first. I think people want to get back to exercise, they want to get back to climbing, but this reconnection with the breath is actually sort of a fundamental place to start. And it's interesting because we've just done this postpartum survey, which we will be sharing the responses with you once we've gone through them. But something that did come up was, I guess, anxiety or fear getting back to climbing, and that connection with the breath is also really closely related to that emotional state. So definitely. I guess that's something that something like Pilates might help people reconnect with before they go back to a sport that has this quite mental element to it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's many practices, even yoga, meditation, these kinds of things. There's a real emphasis on breathing. And one, it relaxes you, gets you in a really good zone mentally. Just the biomechanical movement of the lungs expanding is going to help loosen up this middle back, which can get really tight, especially as we develop with the bump. So it's kind of bringing all of that back, oxygenating the muscles so that they recoup better, get blood flow to the right areas. So, breath is really, really important, but it's also in Pilates, we have a type of breathing called lateral breathing. So we breathe and expand sideways to really maximize the output of our lungs. And how can you do that under load, like a plank or, a pull-up or something like that? So, it's a full mind-body spectrum, it's a very holistic approach to the body and with the breath, but it can be quite anatomical as well. So we want to incorporate both, especially if you're an athlete.
Yeah. I mean, that I can totally see how that would carry through to getting back into climbing really well. So I guess we've touched on the breath, which from what I see is often one of these first things that you can do because you can do that reconnection, and I guess, I don't know, you might be able to correct me here if I'm wrong, it can be done before complete recovery maybe of your sort of any like abdominal separation, or, maybe there's still healing that someone's going through. So is that something people can do straight away, shall we say?
Yeah,
or
so
is there...
usually if I'm working with someone who's, in postnatal recovery, the first thing I want to see is how they're breathing. Because if you're not breathing effectively, then you'll probably, and what I find actually is a lot of people tend to breathe abdominally. So if you've obviously had the separation, you want to try not avoid that type of breathing. Naturally, when we sleep, we do breathe abdominally. There's nothing wrong with breathing down in that space, especially if you follow some kind of flow of energy. But in terms of training and recruiting correctly, you want to practice this kind of lateral breath. And there's different types of breathing in Pilates as well. We could go over that at some point. And then also, motherhood is quite stressful. Okay,
I can
all
imagine.
of a sudden, especially if you've been quite an independent person, all of a sudden your whole being is around this child. So I'll often find that people have got so much tension and they're just breathing up here.
Yeah, chest breathing. Like, it's sort of classic, isn't it? If you imagine someone who's in a really stressful position, you imagine like sort of, it's all up here.
Tension, breastfeeding, if you're breastfeeding, even just holding the little one, it can just cause so much tension and anxiety here. So we want to try get the breath deeper into the lungs and try just settle this area a little bit as well. And that, is fundamental before even starting doing any kind of muscle stuff.
So I guess on that point, what sort of is the timeline maybe after someone's had a baby that you might start working with someone, or that you have, and is there anything sort of stand out that really affects that timeline in your experience?
So as a general rule, we kind of say after 6 weeks, come and start your foundational training. However, every person's completely different. If you've had a C-section, for instance, you might need a bit of a longer period of time. There's factors, a prolapse can affect your recovery, and, sometimes people do need subsequent surgeries afterwards, and generally that 6-week period is a time for you just to kind of realize you've got this baby and how much your life has changed. People are quite exhausted. I find often, mums with their first child tend to be need a little bit more time than somebody who's had a second or third child, just because it's all very new. So you don't want to add the pressure to get, because some people get very obsessive about, I've got to get back to training, I've got to get back in it, especially athletes, but take that time. It's a mental and emotional process as well, and you will get there. But, I usually say between sort of 6 to 8 weeks, unless there's been some very serious complications.
Yeah. And in that time, I guess with the breathing, like you said, maybe the rib breathing, is that something that maybe people would just try and incorporate a bit of focus in that area throughout their day? Or is it the sort of thing where actually you could stand in front of the mirror for 5 minutes and focus on that? Or does it not matter? I don't know. Do you tend to...
I personally think that, prescribing a specific, time period is completely individual, really. Just whenever you can, think about your breath. How am I breathing? Am I feeling stressed at this moment? How can I breathe better? Doing a little posture check as well is quite good. Where am I feeling those discomfort areas? Can I, just by leaning a bit more into my toes, find that sense of abdominal breath connection better, because sometimes people tend to breathe very outwards and up here, and just kind of getting that centering, and that's not going to do any damage or do it very complicated, but it just helps you reconnect a bit. Anytime when you're waiting for the kettle to boil, think about how you're breathing in that moment, and where are you standing in that moment in terms of your posture.
I think it's probably really nice for people to be like, this is something I can do, and also to know it's safe as well. So I know you've worked with climbers specifically, and we were actually chatting a little bit before about some of the challenges with people that come from certain sports that have these quite big movements and maybe quite big dominant muscle groups and stuff like that. I guess from your work with climbers, do you think there is anything that stands out as like certain cues you have to give them, or I don't know, anything that you think sort of...
The biggest thing that I noticed with all the athletes I've trained is they're very strong. They like to do the big movements. They like to use the superficial muscles, but less is more. So starting really basic, working on your stability is usually the first point of call. Finding, like, can you actually recruit the small muscles that support those bigger muscle movements, and finding where those weak areas are, because it's easy to kind of mask certain movement patterns, incorrect movement patterns with bigger muscles, but over time that's when you get your repetitive strains and your injuries. And so just really thinking about less is more. Find the smaller movements, first, because that's a lot to do with posture setup as well.
So I guess, like, to turn probably most of what we've talked about on its head, we've talked about a lot of things that you can do. I'm also quite interested from your perspective if there's anything you think should really be avoided. I know, say, nowadays on the internet, there's quite a lot of things. People might go back to their core workouts, someone that they had before that worked for them. I don't know, just in your sort of view, is there any things that are like particularly troublesome maybe for people in this period that actually could cause some damage or should be avoided and maybe replaced with the smaller movements?
My background is I come from a martial art background. I've not necessarily spent a lot of time in the gym setup, although I have worked in it a fair bit. In terms of the training, so once we've had the separation in the abs, you want to try avoid exercises that are heavy loaded on the abdominals. So like what I've seen in gyms, and obviously everyone's got their different training regimes, but for instance, crunches where they're lying on their back and they're curling all the way up to the knees and all of that. I would avoid doing that until you've actually ideally till the separation is closed as much as it can. Doing, very high weights is probably not great until you've actually built up that foundation in the abdominals. I find also, though, with athletes, they tend to have a better sense of their bodies in general, even after birth. So, I find they can actually find, say a plank-based exercise, they can actually find that quite easy because muscle memory is still there. So it's just it's quite hard to say because everyone has an individual experience, and, it depends how difficult they found the birth, what happened in the birth, what happened in their pregnancy, if they got any injuries or, but generally, I mean, it's just sort of common sense, don't overload. Make sure when you're doing ab work, you're not kind of pushing your tummy out and doming. You're actually thinking about how can I recruit inwards a little bit and get that full recruitment, and don't do, very fast-paced reps. Do it slow, controlled. I know sometimes with CrossFit they do the, quite quick movements to build up those muscle fibers, which is not a bad thing, but I'd generally say avoid that until you've got the foundation better. Slow, precise, and with your breath is
and that's
the best
a really
way.
good point, because I think a lot of people, if they've done a certain training exercise before, it might not necessarily, obviously there is a lot of individuality here, it might not necessarily be inappropriate, but it's how you approach that movement or thing that you're doing, which might change
thinking
quite a
about
lot.
your movement before you do it, and then actually developing the muscle and endurance again in the muscle, which requires a slower pace. I think that's really key.
And one thing that I think comes up a lot, and, for a lot of athletes or climbers is, they've had certain goals and they have certain expectations of their performance. I guess from your work with people, or even just from your own experience, is there anything that you have found or people have found particularly useful in that space? Maybe sort of someone who is really used to setting out goals, laying out weeks, that kind of thing. I don't know, that maybe has to change as well for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously your body's been through a lot, so it's really important to be a bit more gentle with yourself. And, every athlete or, professional performer, whether it's a dancer or any movement background, they know what their body's capable of. Now it may not be as up to scratch where they want to, but that's the easy part, actually. It's the mental acceptance of the change that you've just been through, and trying to be okay with that and set different goals. It's just where you're at this moment in time. So, there's no reason why you can't go back to that training. But if you don't do it properly and set different kinds of expectations first, then you're going to get your injuries, you know. So I would always say, if that's your mindset, definitely set goals, but set new goals first, and then you can get back to that and really actually nurture your mental state. Because motherhood is, it's wonderful, but it's very difficult. It's like you're learning a new skill, especially as a new mum myself. I had to learn a lot to accept that I'm not as good as, I once was at mentally doing all the things that I could do in a complicated decision-making process. You're distracted, you still got the mom kind of brain fog a little bit. Some days you're training, you're just not going to be there, and just write it off as that's the day I can't do it, and just focus on other things. Your mental and self-care is so important, because your body will do whatever your mind will tell it, so you've got to actually accept that, if you're not in the right headspace, don't push the pressure on yourself.
Especially at a time where, I guess, from those initial principles of Pilates you had, but they are also there in movement for climbing and any movement, focus and concentration. You need that to form those, that reconnection with your core and how your body's functioning. So maybe that almost is the goal, that that will be the intention of any of the exercise you do. And if that can't be fulfilled, then it's not, you know, then it's time maybe to just reschedule that session or like not do it.
And it's just, you know, like motherhood and training, it just takes a bit of organizing and planning your day in a way that you feel capable of doing each role that you are doing, you know. So, you know, really trying to, if you want to get back to training, don't stress about the housework or the things. If you've got a partner that can help you, you know, take, you know, the baby out for a walk or something like that, so that you can actually just get into the headspace. Because I know myself personally, getting back to, you know, getting my body back after childbirth, I needed baby out of the house for me to actually really be able to focus, you know. And if that's what it takes for you to get back to your training, don't feel guilty about it. Just, you know, setting those kinds of mental spaces is actually really important, not just the physical. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you so much, Sam. So we will link to Sam's Facebook page and website. She's actually only just coming back from maternity leave herself though, but I'm sure there's lots of great stuff on there, and that's where you could get in contact with Sam. You also do one-to-one Zoom consultations and stuff like that. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. And good luck.